When you think about the early days of the company and you think about where you are today, like obviously vastly different businesses in so many different ways and vastly different world, what are the attributes you were looking for like early? Most of the people listening to this are early stage founders. What are those attributes like in the early days that you were looking for?
To oversimplify, the biggest difference at scale, scale can be 500 employees, 1,000 employees, 5,000 employees in early days is when you look at execution, right? Execution really is very, very different at different levels of scale. And I have this mental model that talks about, look, if the average number of direct reports is 7, right, then a 1 layer organization is 1 person, 2 layers is 8, 3 layers is 57, 4 layers is 300. And so those numbers, somewhere between those numbers gives you a sense of the break point because a 3 layer organization operates very differently than a 4 layer organization. You've got people that really need to be close to the problem. They want to be close to the product, the customer, whatever the issue is. But once, they become a second line manager or a third line manager, you can't really do that. You can't touch every single deal. You can't touch every single feature. You can't look at every line of code. And so you've got to develop different types of systems and structures, how to communicate, how to bring people together. And so those are the biggest differences. But if you're like, call it below 30 employees, you don't necessarily need to do that. I know a lot of advisors might come to you and say, hire for scale, hire that VP of sales that comes out of this type of organization. You don't always need that in the early stages. But then what you have to be comfortable doing is you have to be comfortable making a change, right? Because the person that got you from, call it $0 to $10 million, 0 to 75 employees is not going to be necessarily the same person that gets you through the next phase.
I love that. There are so many investors that tell their companies that are doing 5 million of ARR, they say, you got to go get that VP of sales, get the person who's seen it at 100 million. And you have these founders going out hiring search firms and hiring people who ran a $200 million business at Google last year, had never worked at a startup. And then the founder wonders, why did it not work?
That's often the story, right?
Right,
Oh,
right. But the thing you said, which I think actually no one, I've talked to other guests about this. The thing you said, which is super important, is you have to get the person who's right for the right size and scale and trajectory, but then you have to be comfortable replacing that person at some time, most likely. And that's kind of that trade-off, but that actually is a better strategy than getting the person today for the business that's 7 years from today.
that's right. That's right. So much of the advice has to be context sensitive. And so what we try to do in the book is to come up with generic advice. Maybe some context is helpful if we're going to talk about the book. Um, I've been on my founder's journey, and I had my critical moment when we were about 150 employees or so, where in hindsight, I really felt like, hey, that was a make or break moment. If I hadn't evolved and grown and developed, who knows if the company can be there. There's a critical person during that time, this guy, Richard Hagberg, who is he's an executive coach. These days I call him a founder's coach, but he's been doing exec coaching for about 30 years and maybe more. In the last decade or so, he's been working almost exclusively with founders. And so he goes pretty deep with, up to about 200 founders. But the unique thing about Rich is he's got a framework, he's got a system, and it's really based on data. So he collects data on about 46 different competencies, leadership competencies, and about 100 or so plus personality attributes. And so when you work with them, he collects how you do against those 46 competencies. He collects what you are like against these personalities, and he's able to play back to you, hey, the reason you are the way you are, the reason you lead, ultimately, is based on who you are. And so given that, here's why people say you're like what you're like. Here's the natural deficiency that you would expect to have given your personalities. And he's figured out really that founders cluster, not surprisingly, in a set of personalities that ultimately lead to a bunch of leadership gaps. And so what we found is the same things that make up a founder, make us do what we do, ultimately are the seeds, right? The seeds sown of our own destruction. So we call founders, they're like ticking time bombs, right? Maybe a ticking time bomb, but without the clock. So when is it going to run down to zero? When is one of the things that made you what you are, great at what you do? What's when you're going to trip up on it? and what to do about it, right? How do you spot those things and how do you avoid that? And so we call the book Founders Keepers, but that's the basis of things. And I know it's a little bit self-reflective, right, about who we are as people and as
It's amazing, actually. When you read it, you just you I can go to certain moments in time in my journey, and like I literally am like reliving experiences